Hey, hello, what's up, guys? This is Vishnu Nadal, and today let us talk about processors and why do they lead an important role in our day-to-day lives. And let's get started. The design complexity of CPUs increased as various technologies facilitated building smaller and more reliable electronic devices. The first such improvement came with the advent of the transistor. Transistorized CPUs during 1950s and 1960s no longer had to build out of a bulky, unreliable, and fragile switching elements like vacuum tubes and relays. With this improvement, more complex and reliable CPUs were built onto one or several printed circuit boards containing discrete components. Transistors are the building blocks of the integrated circuits, such as a computer processor or CPUs. Modern CPUs contain millions of individual transistors that are microscopic in size. Transistors in computer processors often turn signals on or off. However, transistors can also change the amount of current being sent. In computing, a processor or processing unit is an electronic circuit which performs operations or some external data source, usually memory or some other data stream. It typically takes the form of a microprocessor which is fabricated on a single metal oxide semiconductor integrated circuit chip. A central processing unit, also called a central processor or main processor, is an electronic circuitry within a computer that executes instructions that make up a computer program, like Windows OS and Mac OS or something like that. And the CPU performs basic arithmetic, logic, controlling, and input-output operations specified by the instructions in the program. The computer industry uses a central processing unit as early as 1955. Traditionally, the term CPU refers to a processor, more specifically to its processing unit and control unit, distinguishing these core elements of a computer from external components such as main memory and I/O circuitry. Most modern CPUs are microprocessors, where the CPU is contained on a single metal oxide semiconductor integrated circuit chip. An IC that contains a CPU may also contain memory, peripheral interfaces, and other components of a computer. Such integrated devices are variously called microcontrollers or system on chip. Some computers employ a multi-core processor, which is single chip or socket containing two or more CPUs called cores. Array processors or vector processors have multiple processors that operate in parallel with no unit considered central. Virtual CPUs are an abstraction of a dramatical aggregated computational resources. So now let's talk about control unit. The control unit is a component of the CPU that directs the operation of this processor. It tells the computer memory, arithmetic and logical unit, and input and output devices how to respond to the instructions that have been set to the processor. And this is all about the control processing unit. Like control unit. And now let's talk about arithmetic logic unit, which is ALU, is designed as circuitry within the processor that performs integrated arithmetic and bitwise logic operations. The inputs to the ALU are the data words to be operated, status information from previous operations, and a code from control unit indicating which operation to perform. Depending on the instructions being executed, the operands may come from internal CPU registers or external memory, or they may be constants generated by the ALU itself. Now let's talk about address generating unit, which is AGU, sometimes also called as address computation unit, which is ACU, is an execution unit inside the CPU that calculates addresses used by the CPU to access main memory. By having address calculations handled by separate circuitry that operates in parallel with the rest of the CPU, the number of CPU cycles required for executing various machine instructions can be reduced, bringing performance improvements and reliability. And now let's talk about MMU, which is Memory Management Unit. Most high-end microprocessors in desktop, laptop, and server computers have a memory management unit translating logic addresses into physical RAM addresses. By the way, what's logical addresses, which is 0 and 1, which is nothing but binary. So, providing memory protection and pegging abilities useful for virtual memory. Simpler processors, especially microprocessors, usually don't include an MMU. Now let's talk about cache. A CPU cache is a hardware cache used by a central processing unit of a computer to reduce the average cost or time or energy to access data from the main memory. A cache is a smaller, faster memory closer to the processor core, which stores up copies of the data from frequently used main memory locations. Most CPUs have different independent cache, including instructions and data cache, where the data cache is usually organized as a hierarchy of more cache levels. Now let's talk about clock rate. Most CPUs are synchronous circuits, which means they employ a clock signal to pace their sequentially operations. The clock signal is produced by an external oscillator circuit that generates a constant number of pulses each second in the form of periodic square wave. The frequency of the clock pulses determines the rate at which a CPU executes instructions, and consequently, the faster the clock, the more instructions the CPU will execute each second. Now let's talk about the voltage regulating module, which many modern CPUs have a die integrated power managing module which regulates on demand voltage supply to the CPU circuitry, allowing it to keep balance between performance and power consumptions.